serving as Chancellor of the Exchequer. Both men on occasion stood in for the Prime Minister in chairing War Cabinet meetings. In April 1917, more than 6 months before the declaration, Curzon chaired a committee on the territorial desiderata in Asia, recommending in his report to the War Cabinet that Palestine should be under definite and exclusive British control for the safeguarding of communications with the Far East. In June 1920, as Foreign Secretary, he explained to Parliament that regarding Palestine, we went there for distinct military and strategic objectives, namely to protect the flank of Egypt, which was threatened by the direct menace of Turkish arms. It was on military grounds that we found ourselves in the Holy Land. Andrew Bonar Law, himself a Zionist, explained to the House of Commons in March 1918, just 4 months after the Balfour Declaration, that it was very far from the case that the advance into Palestine had come about for political or moral reasons. We are a great Eastern power. If we realize what it means from the military point of view, then let the House consider what our position in the East would have been today if after we had been compelled to abandon the Dardanelles expedition, we had left the position in Palestine as it was. Operations there and in Mesopotamia, i.e. Iraq, had permanently relieved all danger of attack on Egypt. Also in Parliament, the prominent Labour Party Zionist Josiah Wedgwood spoke frequently on the matter. If it seemed possible, Britain cleared out of Egypt, as he put it, in response to intensifying nationalist pressure, thus leaving the Suez Canal undefended. We are, he suggested in March 1922, bound to use Palestine as a base for the protection of that local point. These imperialist perspectives were shared by 2 other members of the War Cabinet, Lord Milner, Alfred Milner, and the South African leader, General Jan Smuts, who joined in 1917. Milner, describing himself as an imperialist out and out, and one of the drafters of the Balfour Declaration, had served the Empire in South Africa and in London became successively War Secretary and Colonial Secretary between 1918 and 1921. It was his conviction, writes his biographer, Vladimir Halperin, that a Jewish national home in Palestine would decisively contribute to the security of the British Empire in the Near East, that is, Egypt and Suez. In Milner's own words, Egypt is of vital importance to our whole imperial system. As for Smuts, another convinced Zionist, Lloyd George himself noted how he had expressed very decided views as to the strategical importance of Palestine to the future of the British Empire. In April 1917, Smuts told the so-called Territorial Committee of the War Cabinet, chaired again by Curzon, that British possession of Palestine was essential on grounds of strategy and imperial communications. Any other power in control of Palestine would constitute a serious menace. And what of Lloyd George, the man who took all the final decisions on major issues of foreign policy? He has not left much of a paper trail, and his retrospective comments on events have usually to be treated with great caution. He was a brilliant war leader, but also a brilliant deceiver. Maynard Keynes penned a chilling Anglo-Saxon impression of the Welshman. Lloyd George is rooted in nothing. He is void and without content. One catches in his company that flavour of final purposelessness, of inner irresponsibility. But there are clues around us to his motivations in Palestine. The territory was, he declared in 1917, the one really interesting part of the war. And when the Liberal Chief Whip, Neil Primrose, asked him that same year, what about Palestine? His reply, reportedly with a smile, was, oh, we must grab that. Most historians seem to agree that his principal concern after the removal of the German threat in the Middle East was that the French might, in demanding Syria for themselves after the war, include Palestine in the claim, on the grounds that it had, under Turkish rule, been treated as part of administrative Syria. That's very much the argument pursued by Meyer Verite in his 1970 article, The Balfour Declaration and Its Makers, suggesting indeed that Lloyd George used the Zionists as a means of keeping the French well away from the Suez Canal. The occupation, coupled with support for the Zionist cause, comments Verite, was the neatest, most convenient and becoming way of making France abandon her share in Palestine. Assuming near total control of foreign policy during the war, Lloyd George largely ignored the Foreign Office and the finer points of advice offered by his two successive Foreign Secretaries, Balfour and Curzon, relying instead on what the historian Margaret Macmillan, a great-granddaughter of the Prime Minister, calls his own staff of bright young men. And two of these, working in the Cabinet Secretariat, were Leo Amery and Sir Mark Sykes. Both men had clear imperialist perspectives, with Amery, the bolder of the two, advising at one point that Britain ought to annex Iceland and Greenland. He had a close hand in the drafting of the Balfour Declaration and went on to become successively Conservative Colonial Secretary and Dominion Secretary. He observed in a later memoir that his initial interest in Palestine had been largely strategical, given his growing doubts on the permanence of our protectorate in Egypt. In October 1918, he wrote to Lord Curzon, "Strategically, Palestine and Egypt go together, Palestine being a necessary buffer to the Suez Canal." As for Sir Mark Sykes, Tory MP and an accredited authority on Middle Eastern affairs, his conviction, according to Amery, was that a British Palestine might be an invaluable asset in the defence of the Suez Canal against attack from the north and as a station on the future air routes to India. I'm sorry if this is becoming repetitive, but this sort of verbal substantiation of the imperialist case is near universal, with only Arthur Balfour the major exception. The man Lloyd George claimed to be his favourite military journalist, Herbert Sidebotham of the Manchester Guardian, then under the editorship of Lloyd George's friend, the Zionist C.P. Scott, gives further clues as to the Prime Minister's thinking. Sidebotham not only wrote innumerable articles and editorials during the war, but also produced 4 books on Palestine. The first of these in 1918, England and Palestine, Essays Towards the Restoration of the Jewish State. The eastern flank of the Suez Canal, he pointed out with reference to recent Turco-German attacks, was highly vulnerable to assault from Palestine by way of the open flatlands of the Sinai Desert. The nearest defensible positions of ancient historical importance were the Beersheba highlands of southern Palestine, and Egypt, being increasingly affected by anti-British nationalism, this a recurring theme, posed a threat to the canal, so to speak, from within. Our military interests, wrote Sidebotham, are dictated mainly by the defence of Egypt and India. To say that Egypt is our master interest in the east is to say that Palestine is our master interest. For Palestine, now as always, is the key to Egypt. And that newly acquired territory would ideally be, as he wrote, inhabited by people at the same stage of political development as ourselves, and as such not a burden, but an increment of strength. In short, what he called a great dominion of Jews. Running parallel with these various arguments was this notion as presented by Sidebotham that the strategic gain represented by the annexation of Palestine would be powerfully supplemented by the country becoming home to a new, self-sustaining European settler community that would be grateful and loyal to its imperial sponsors. Leo Amery, at around the time of the declaration, saw Zionism as a means of establishing a prosperous community bound to Britain by ties of gratitude and interest. Josiah Wedgwood, MP, wrote a book about Palestine entitled, tellingly, The Seventh Dominion, in which he called it emphatically a place where we do want a friendly and efficient population, men on whom we can depend, if only because they depend on us. Herbert Samuel again, the first British High Commissioner in Palestine, 1920 to 25, remarked in his memoirs of his belief at the time that Britain's support for a Jewish national home would lead to goodwill in the Zionist community. This manifestly a matter of importance to the British Empire. Hugh O'Byrne, senior official at the Foreign Office, insisted during the war, "We do not propose to give the Jews a privileged position in Palestine for nothing, but we should expect wholehearted support from them in return. They should be allowed to grow," as he put it, "strong enough to cope with the Arab population, thereby enabling Britain to strike a bargain for Jewish support." And Chaim Weizmann and his Zionist colleagues in London seemed eager to oblige. Weizmann promising Lloyd George in 1917 that a reconstructed Palestine will become a very great asset to the British Empire. It would, he suggested, in another context, be the Asiatic Belgium. Max Nordau, a co-founder with Theodor Herzl of the World Zionist Organization, told a London audience in 1919 that included Lloyd George and Balfour, "We shall have to be the guards of the Suez Canal. We shall have to be the sentinels of your way to India via the Near East." Weizmann had consistently argued the case among Zionists that their project could only advance if it was in close alliance with British imperialism. And great power sponsorship was, as Avi Schleim argues, not only essential in 1917 and the years immediately following, but was to remain, as he puts it, a constant through the entire history of the Jewish national home and the successor state of Palestine, of Israel. The title of this piece refers to ignorance and reflex, and it's to these issues that I now turn by way of conclusion, appraising, as I mentioned at the outset, the quality of the decision-making process. My general point here is that when the British government made its momentous decision in November 1917 to support a Jewish national home, it acted not in accordance with carefully assembled information and cautious logical debate, but largely by reflex, to some extent war-pressured, strategic reflex, racist reflex, anti-Semitic reflex. And I'll continue to focus on matters imperial, but do wish to divert a little to say a word or two on the lesser propaganda factor. The notion, to recap, the declaration was essentially an appeal to foreign Jews in the hope that they would persuade their respective governments, most notably that of the United States, into more committed support for the Allied cause in the war. Ignorance and reflex were very much in play. The British relying for information on American Jewry, not so much on their embassy experts in Washington, as on private conversations with Chaim Weizmann in London. This has been well documented in Renton's book, The Zionist Masquerade, already cited. British ministers and officials were led to believe, first, that a majority of American Jews were Zionist, and second, that Zionists enjoyed critical influence with the Woodrow Wilson administration. As Renton amply demonstrates, on my own partial examination of contemporary American newspapers confirms, both views were illusory, and in the sense that exaggerated power was attributed to Jewish or Zionist cabals, reflexively anti-Semitic. Britain's eventual support for Zionism, Renton comments, was based upon a completely erroneous assessment of Jewry and Zionism. The government failed to engage in careful investigation, falling back on cultural preconceptions and the erroneous assumptions that the foreign policy-making elite held regarding Jewish identity and influence. Sir Mark Sykes remarked at the time of the declaration, when we buy into a thing like Zion, which is atmosphere, cosmopolitan, subconscious and unwritten, nay, often unspoken, it is not possible to work and think on ordinary lines. More generally, and in relation to imperialist thinking over Palestine, it should be noted that some of the men who decided to sponsor the Jewish national home were not notably well informed on the outside world, at least that large part of it that lay beyond the shores of Europe. Lord Curzon considered that his colleague Arthur Balfour, who rarely travelled abroad, not only had the mind of a marshmallow, but was the worst and most dangerous foreign secretary